Greetings, students. I'm Dr. Sadri, again, your instructor for this course. And today I'm going to talk about Chapter 17. And if you recall, the topic of Chapter 17 is international law. As I've mentioned before, the two topics of international law and international organizations, they go hand in hand, okay? It's interesting that your, textbook starts with international organization in chapter 15, and then it waits for two more chapters to get to what? International law. Because for some people, they see international law precedes international organization because all of the international organizations are established based on a charter, which is considered an international agreement, and that international agreement is part of international law. So that seems to be coming first. However, international organizations also, they have contributed to creation of international law. So it's like a two-way street. Is that right? All right. Having said that one, we have in this one actually, a shorter, PowerPoint. I hope that you open up your PowerPoint when I'm lecturing so you see the connection between those, because obviously I cannot cover all of the material in the book plus all the material that I want to add to it myself as a background or complementary material, all in about, 20, 25 minutes or something. So let's do the best we can. So today we have 15 slides. So starting first of all with the learning, objectives, which has two sections as always. Summary of the major aspect of the chapter, and I'm going to go over the theoretical perspective on international law, and then the evolution of international law, or some people call history of it, then International Court of Justice or ICJ, and then is the sources of the public international law, and then the practice of international law, and then last but not least a conclusion. Having said that one, then what should we remember from this? That what public international law is and how is what practiced. So having said that one, let's start with the notion of what is public international law. I want you, before I even start, to think about it this way, that the same way that in any kind of domestic system, we have a constitution. Is that right? I mean, when we teach about American government, what do? We constantly talk about constitution. And the U.S. federal constitution, as you know, is actually not a very large document. It's only a few pages, all right? But the advantage of having law and constitution and everything is basically provide two very important pieces of information. Like, what are the rights of the citizens? What are the responsibilities of the citizens? What are the rights of the government? What are the responsibilities of the government? You see what I mean? So at both government level, the ruler, and the ruled people, is that right? They both have their rights and responsibilities. Now, why this is the case? Well, this is the case because when we talk about those, this is an upper division, in the upper division courses, we kind of take it for granted. But in any human society, there is a need for a sense of order. So a human community doesn't exist without an order. You might say, I'm not suggesting that is always fair though, What I'm saying is any human community, and that means two people or more, they need a sense of order. And this sense of order is not always written. Is that right? For example, if you have a roommate and you're living in a dormitory, there are some kind of rules between you and your roommate. Like what? Like, for example, when one of us, we have a test the next day and we want peace and quiet, don't bring, all your friends to the room and, play your music loud. Is that right? Or if you do that, for example, sometimes they set up a rule that, okay, if one of us has an exam, the person who has an exam should go to the library. You see? There is no written rule. Is that right? It's whatever you come up with. Basically, the bottom line is that agreement between the two of you brings a sense of peace and order to that room. Or for example, what time, people, wanted to go to sleep. If one of them is, sleeping late, the other one is sleeping early. You see what I mean? There are all those agreements right there. Again, those are all to do what? To bring a sense of order. Okay? And remember, when we are talking about countries and peoples and this and that, we are not suggesting that always that order is fair. We are not suggesting that always that order is democratic, or dictatorial or whatever. a sense of order. Okay, having said that one, we can say that a public international law refers to a body of rules and has developed over many centuries to regulate the relations among states. And that is very important. And in that regard, obviously, nowadays includes also intergovernmental organization. However, I told you a little bit about the domestic system. There is a big difference between international law and the domestic law. Why? Because in domestic law, no matter what type of system it is, there is a very serious enforcement there. You see? Like, for example, in domestic law, all right, if you, going beyond the speed limit, there is a highway patrol or a police officer or even members of, a sheriff department or something, that they would stop you and we say, look, this is a 35 miles, speed limit area. You're driving 75 miles. You see what I mean? They stop you, they give you a ticket, etc., etc. And international level, many of the rules, there is no like international police. I know that some of you say, no, Dr. Sadi, there is Interpol. Interpol has a very, very limited role, okay? It usually deals with making sure that there is no criminal activities or something, or if somebody applying for a passport and is a criminal or something, they pass that type of information from one country to another. So the next country knows that should we issue them any kind of visa or not? Should we issue them a passport or not? Their home country as opposed to the host country. So there are rules like that. But you don't see like a highway patrol with international poles, flag, and they say, wait a minute, you are going too fast in this area and you can endanger other ships. We are going to give you a ticket. There is not such a thing. Basically, international law, it's a kind of assumes like it's a law among states and it's among civilized people. Well, let's face it, not all states in the world, they act civilized. Is that right? In the domestic system, still, when we said somebody can get a ticket, yeah, they don't get a ticket all the time because there's no police everywhere all the time. So once or twice or three times they can get away, with, speeding up and breaking the rules associated with that. But eventually, sometimes they get caught, okay? Now, in international, law, many times people, they can get away with stuff, So just because there is a violation of it, I don't want you to think that because there is a violation of international law, so there is no international law, because that's what some people argue. You know what I mean? So they say, oh yeah, because there is. Oh, there's also a lot of, violation of domestic law. Which one of us is going to say, oh, there is no domestic law, So just be careful about that one. So in the domestic, law, as I mentioned, there is the concern that, the notion of governing within the state. Is that right? And who are they governing? The governing people. And there is, of course, private, and then the problem is, as I mentioned, that, emphasis is usually put on the enforcement, okay? So international law is like a law for ladies and gentlemen. And let's face it, not everybody acts like a lady or a gentleman. But in the domestic law, even in the most democratic countries like US, Switzerland, is that right? You don't follow the law, you're going to have a problem with the police, you see, eventually, even if they miss you once or twice. So private international law is also very important because private international law is trying to bring a sense of order to private actors. Is that right? If they are an individual or if there is a multinational corporation or something. So in that regard, it's very important to say that public international law is about dispute that associated among the states about the territories or something else. Now, having said that one, now let's move on to the whole notion of theories of international law. In that regard, we're going to cover 4 of them. The very first one is the one that is very famous, the legal positivist. Is that right? Or positivism. And in that regard, they say that the legal positivists, they argue that international law should reflect only the customary practice of states, not some ideal of universal morality. In other words, they say that, look, it really depends, and they should cover the customs. And now, okay, there is some kind of moral rules that, rules the universe. That's one very interesting argument. In this regard, they're focusing on institutions and not some supernatural, body of law that rules everything. Okay, so who do you think would be very much for this? Many realists in international relations are focused on that. Is that right? Because they say that this is the function of it to protect the national interest of the states. And it disregards any kind of international institution or sharing the ideas. So that's one. Kind of opposite to this one is a group, we can say those people who are a little bit more idealistic and everything, they kind of focus on what? Natural law. And they say these natural laws are the laws that they're a part of our rights as we are born and as we exist in this community. So they support that natural law believes that there are universal moral principles, okay, and then that international law should be, informed by the morality. So as you can see, this point of view is very much opposite of the other point of view. Is that right? So in that regard, they say natural law scholars, they suggest that normative principles are fundamental aspect of international law, and they should apply to everybody, regardless of if they are national sovereigns or not. And they say that international law should be used against those states that they broke those, laws and everything. So as I mentioned, and here they usually include, issues associated with citizens, human right abuses and everything else. So two very different perspectives. The third perspective is what they call the critical legal studies. The critical legal studies is really the result of what happened from 1980s. It started developing from that time period, and it has a literature in international law about that one. And it basically argues that the traditional hierarchies and languages and procedures of international law, they reinforce the interest of those powerful states, because those were the powerful states that they came up with many of these rules and regulations. So the system is a little bit biased. That's what they argue. Is that right? So in that regard, they say that then even morally driven natural law is insufficient to deal with these type of social forces of that are hierarchical, patriotic, chauvinistic, and ultimate form of nationalism. Is that right? Very nationalistic, and privileges that certain groups they have than others. The fourth theories of that is called the Third World Approaches to International Law, or for short, TWAIL. Is that right? So, in this one, basically, they suggest that, and they highlight the fact that the extent of to which the modern international law is really historically rooted in colonialism, oppression, and inequalities. What are they talking about? Third world countries, or what nowadays we call global south, many of them, they used to be a colony of some of those powerful states. So the way they look at it is very different. When international law comes from the perspective of the, powerful states, they say, oh, things are fair. Is that right? The little countries, that they were the subject of it, and they notice that, oh my gosh, I can't do this, I can't do that because the rules are against me, You know what this reminds me? Once I saw a little cartoon somewhere, and if I find it, I'll put it somewhere in our course or add it to this. There was a cartoon made by, somebody that was showing three different fish. One was very small, one was medium sized, and one was very large. Okay, and they all had their mouth open. The little fish was just eating planktons. Is that right? And the medium sized fish was getting ready to eat the little guy. And the big sized fish was ready to eat the medium sized one. And then next to each one there was something. The little sized one, next to it there was a word. The word is not fair. Why? Because it was going to be eaten. Is that right? And the bigger guy was saying, the biggest one. Is that right? The big one, he was saying, oh, the word is really fair because he's the top predator. Is that right? It's probably a shark or something like that. And eating what? Eating the other guys, and there are not too many, they don't have too many enemies. Is that right? And the middle guy, the fish in the middle, was saying, well, the world is sometimes fair and sometimes not fair. You see what I mean? So it shows your perspective. It's kind of, that reminds me of this type of conversation usually. So in that regard, you can see that many of the global south, countries, they would say that this system is biased against them. And they also emphasize the fact that TWAIL focuses on a lot of issues like social issues, like, environmental issues that other type of laws, they have a tendency to forget. Okay. Having said that one, let's right now talk a little bit about the evolution of international law. Well, your text, like a typical, text written about international relations, usually focuses on, okay, the, international law pretty much started right after the Treaty of Westphalia. And you already know, based on chapters that we read earlier, the treaty was signed. There were actually not one treaty, there were two treaties, and they were signed in 1648. And then one of them basically ended, they basically both, in some ways, they ended the 30-year war in Europe, which was basically has a religious dimension and everything else. Okay. What was the other aspect of these treaties? These treaties, yes, they ended the religious wars, but they actually crystallized the notion of a sovereign state. That's a key issue. Now, when your book is talking about the Peace of Westphalia or the Treaty of Westphalia and 1648 and things like that, something that I want you to remember is this. It doesn't mean international law started from there. The best way to remember it is this way. Modern international law became, dated to that time. But the international law existed way before that. It goes all the way back to the relationship between the Persian Empire and the Romans and Persians and the Greeks and the Chinese and others, you see what I mean? So there was laws before. In fact, there were customs before. Way before this. Like what? Like, for example, in the naval area, when people, to make sure that a ship, you can recognize a difference between a merchant ship and a military ship, they would use different flags, or they would put lights at night. They would put different color lights in front or the back or the middle of the ship. You see what I mean? And then there was a treaty, how do you treat this ship, if it's a military ship or if it's a civilian. You see what I mean? That is international law. That's a customs, but it's not like written, and then later on it became part of the written words. Is that right? But at the beginning was. So I don't want you to think that, basically all international law started from 1648. We can say the modern version of it started, but there has also existed. There were treaties associated with immunity of ambassadors between between the Romans and the Persians. Because before, let's say, for example, the emperor of one would send a message to the other one, is that or ambassador? Okay. If the ambassador is carrying what? Carrying, for example, a letter from his own emperor, just passing it to the other guy. Well, before these traditions they come up between the two empires, one was angry with the message because they thought, this message is very, rude, cut the head of the ambassador. Oh, well, if you just do it a couple of times, who wants to be an ambassador anymore? The ambassadors, it's not like their idea, they're just carrying the information, is that right? So in that regard, we should say that there were a lot of rules and regulations that tradition came out about diplomatic immunity, blah, 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 way before 1648. Is that right? And then one of the other things we should say, now that we are back to after 1648, we can say that this modern international law, many of the really codes and organization and everything, and by the way, if you look, you would see that there is a guy by the name of Hugo Grotius, who was a Dutch scholar. He is famous to be the father of the modern international law. Just wanted to put that one there. But many of these laws and everything, they started really with codification and organization and reorganization of the 1899 and 1907 Hague conventions, okay, about peace and war and everything else. Okay. The other aspect of international, law and its evolution that I can say is after World War I, as you know, international law, based on international law and League of Nations, they came up with the idea, maybe we should have a neutral legal, entity. So they came up with something called Permanent Court of International Justice, or PCIJ. Well, their job was basically, if there is something legal between the states, we resolve it. So if it's resolved legally, then they would not expand, they would not expand the whole notion to become eventually a hot war. Is that right? They would settle it down illegally. But with the failure of international, basically international system in terms of, not letting League of Nations to do anything. Is that right? Because their hands were tied. But back as League went, so did what? PCIJ. But the fact that PCIJ did some stuff, the founders of the UN, they said, what we should do? After we establish UN, we should also have a court like that. And they actually set up something called International Court of Justice, or ICJ. Okay? Now, we are going to slide number 10. And in slide number 10, what is ICJ? Well, ICJ is basically also known as the World Court. Okay, it composed of 15 judges. These judges are usually chosen for a 9-year period, and they're coming from some of the best legal minds of many of these countries. They're elected and selected and everything else. And they basically hear, two types of things. One is they try to resolve the dispute between states, and then they can also provide advisory opinion for other UN bodies or whoever maybe asks their opinion. So it's basically following the tradition that PCIJ started, but of course, as I mentioned, PCIJ went out of business. Is that right? Died with League of Nations, and then this is a new one. Okay, so what else does ICJ do? ICJ tries to help resolve various international disputes, because if you can resolve it peacefully, is that right? It's not going to get expanded, and it's not going to eventually end up in a war. However, here we go. There are restrictions right there. ICJ cannot say, oh, okay, the police has caught you, you're in my court, now I'm going to tell you what to do. No, that is not the way things are done at international level. Remember, international law, very different from domestic law. International community different from domestic systems. In domestic system, even the most democratic one, there is a power of enforcement. Then, in relationship to that one, you're kind of, well, I take whatever you say. You see what I mean? International law, there is no enforcement in that format. The enforcement is done in a, first of all, they expect people, they police themselves. Okay, not everybody polices themselves well, right? And then the other one is they're hoping that international community informally pressures somebody to follow the law. Okay, and that doesn't happen. So, for a case to come to the attention of the court, it requires consent. Whose consent? The people who are fighting. One of them cannot say, oh, I'm going to take you to the court. I'm going to get my lawyer to sue you, and we're going to take you to the court. Both should want to be there. Okay, that's condition number one. Number two, don't think too much about enforcement. We're hoping that everybody acts in a civilized fashion. After the judges, they give their opinion. They say, okay, well, I understand your point and I understand your decision, and I accept it and I do it. Many times they would say no, and they do whatever they want, or they completely ignore them. Is that right? And another thing is you have to consider that in international law, because as I mentioned before, and third world people or global south people also, they argued there are some unfair advantages. Like, for example, more powerful state, they have better lawyers, they have more resources, and then in cases like that, they can what? They can win more. All right. What are some of the sources of public international law? I would say there are, according to the ICJ, international law has 5 major sources. See, that could make a very interesting short answer. Is that right? Mention 3 out of the 5 major sources of international law. The first one is customs, as we mentioned before. These are the traditional practices of the states, so this would be one source. Second one are international treaties. These are formal agreements that the states, they come, they sign, blah, 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 they read it, they make sure that they understand it correctly. That's the second source. The next source is the national and international court decisions. They go over there and see, okay, in similar cases, which international, court or which international tribune, is that right? Like, for example, the tribunes in Nuremberg, the Tokyo tribunes, that they made some decision about criminal activities during the war or something. How did they decide? The next one is the writing of the legal expert. So legal expert in the world that are famous, and they write books, they do this, they do that. Many of their opinion is what can become a part of international law. And last but certainly not least is the general principle of law. Like, for example, there are certain laws that pretty much in every system is accepted. Like what? Like, for example, murder. Is that right? No country, doesn't matter, democratic, undemocratic, would ever say, murder is okay. Oh yeah, you were, we feel sorry for you. You were angry, you didn't know this. You see what I mean? So that's a part of the what? General principle of law. Another one, self-defense. Somebody is attacking you and you're defending yourself, is that right? And in the process, the other person gets injured. Well, that wouldn't happen if they wouldn't attack you. So you have the right to what? Self-defense. So these are part of the general agreement. Now, what are some of the other things we wanted to mention? There are also some major areas of international law. One of them is, and I'm going to start going over some of these things with you, and in the slide number 12, I brought environmental ones, human rights one, and issues associated with sovereignty. I'm just going over this one because some of these things I've kept mentioning in different way, and very frankly, it's so easy to digest, and your text has done a great job. So I'm not going to go into details. I'm just highlighting it. What are some of the other major, areas of international law? One is the law of the sea. Is that right? You remember when I was talking about the ships? Guess what? As the technology has grown, and we have the ability to do deep sea, explorations and everything else, there are a lot of resources down there. The same way that there is oil in land, there is also oil under the water. Is that right? So who has the right to that one? Who can do this? Who cannot do this? There are also other resources, natural resources that exist. Is that right? And we're talking about, for example, in addition to oil and gas, there is uranium, there is this, there is gold, there is this, everything you can imagine. All right? And this is in addition to all the fish and other, resources there. The next one is the law, the area of the law would be diplomacy. And this would include, for example, things associated with foreign policy and diplomacy. And last but not least, an area of the law which is growing is space law. Is that right? Because space being so important, guys. Is that right? I mean, look at all those satellites we have. None of these phones that we have is going to work without, all those, satellites, transmitting communication we have, internet connection, etc., etc. They recharge some of the antennas. Some of them are working this way. Some of them are working that way. Who's going to be there? Who's not going to be there? All right. Having said that one, I'm going to finish our discussion with these slide number 14 and the next one, focusing on the war and justice. Is that right? One of the things I want to kind of bring to your attention is this. There was a time that people would accept what happens to them. Like in ancient time, let's say, for example, one nation would get defeated by the other one. They say, oh, maybe we did something wrong, and the gods were against us, and we deserve being defeated. You see what I mean? They would accept it. Nowadays, well, it has been actually not just in 21st century. This has happened in the last couple of centuries. People, they don't accept it. They don't say, oh yeah, gods wanted us to get defeated. They say, look, you did this one. This is unfair. This is unjust. And, I need justice. So in other words, the whole notion of peace has been involved so much with justice. So there's that connection right there. Okay. So even when somebody talks about war, there's a whole topic about just war. Which war is acceptable and, just, and which one is not. All right. In this regard, if you notice, your chapter is talking about, for example, their right to go to war, which they use the Latin word just at bellum, and the right, conduct in the war, which is just in bello. So these are basically, the right to go to war is when do you have the opportunity or the right to, protect yourself? Do you need to wait for somebody to attack you, or should you go and attack them first? You see what I mean? So then self-defense had become like a big part of that. There are some states that they say, no, I was sure that they're going to attack me, so I just did it before them, And then how do you even conduct when even in the war there are some behavior? Like, for example, are you supposed to kill as many of the, non-combatants? Is that right? A bunch of basically poor women and children and poor, older people. Is that right? Now, see, these are some of the issues that's come about right now in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. The Ukrainian, they said, look, some of these missiles you're sending, you're not attacking necessarily only our military sites. You're attacking schools, hospitals. You see? That's supposed to be against the law. Is that international law? All right. So what else can we say about all these things that we have been talking about? I have to say that also, nowadays, a lot of people, they say that a major modern development of the law has been with war crimes. That's a very big area for those of you interested in international law. And you see, this started basically right after World War II, with the Nuremberg and the Tokyo trials of all those individuals that, Nuremberg, what did they do? The Nazis that they were killing Jews, some Slavic people, some what do you call it, gypsies, and some other, I mean, they were basically scapegoating people. Is that right? Taking them to concentration camps, using whatever they had, etc., and then, killing them, destroying them. Is that right? Because that was a part of their ideology. Anyway, that's not unacceptable behavior. Same thing with, the Tokyo, what you call it, trials after World War II, people who committed those, war crimes, here and there. Like, for example, sometimes still some Koreans, they had some, complaints about the behavior of the Japanese soldiers in Korea, and some Chinese have done that one historically as well. So I wanted to tell you that, obviously those issues have become more and more and more important for some. One of the other things that we need to consider that in 2002, there was the very first establishment of International Criminal Court, or ICC. Is that right? And ICC is trying to let people know that you cannot cover under the name of your state and say, oh, I didn't have any responsibility, which was like a defense of a lot of the Nazis, When they put them in the Nuremberg trial, many of them would say, well, I'm a wonderful soldier, and I'm the servant of my people, and my Führer, Führer, they refer to, Adolf Hitler, oh, my Führer ordered, and I had to follow. Well, I mean, you have to follow an order that it doesn't seem, treating people like a human being and treating them like a criminal activity. Is that right? Innocent people. So the notion of responsibility has changed. You cannot just hide under, oh, my state, my supervisor told me, or my leader told me, or my whatever told me. You see what I mean? You can't say that. They're coming after you. So it's interesting because this trend shows international law is not focused only on states anymore. It's applying more and more and more to individual behavior. Is that right? And of course, this is not, even though there's moving to that direction, it doesn't mean that there is no criticism. The criticism, especially when it gets to human rights activities, a lot of people, they say, yes, there is a process, but oh my God, it's slow. And we want justice now. Okay? That's one thing. The second thing, it's ineffective. Okay? So you have to be very patient because it takes a long time. In addition to that one, it's not necessarily always achieves the goals that we expected, And then, last but not least, again, they also argue about the sense of bias. They say it's kind of biased toward more powerful state. It's more biased toward certain, groups than others, because maybe they have access to certain resources that they can protect themselves a little bit more. Anyway, having said that, we've covered a lot, folks, about international law. And as you saw, international law and international organization are interconnected. Is that right? And, we covered them both in Module 7. And I hope you enjoyed reading the material about Module 7, because we're going to have, obviously, in addition to posting, we have also a quiz associated with that. All right. I hope that my general discussion covers all the major issues and makes it a little bit easier for you to digest. Is that right? Do not rely only on my lectures. My lectures are trying to help you to identify some of the main issues from the chapters, because the chapters, they provide so many details. Okay? And I don't want you to get lost in the details, but it's important for you to watch these videos and then follow it up with those extensive PowerPoints that are organized for you. Is that right? So you can digest the material, understand and digest the material better, and will be more prepared for our assignment. Thank you so much. And as usual, if you still have any question, guess what? You know what to do. You email me. Have a nice one.